The blizzard hit the ridge like a freight train with no brakes. Samuel Hartley pressed his shoulder against the cabin door as it rattled on its hinges ice crystals, forcing their way through every crack in the wood. 3 winters alone up here had taught him the mountain's moods, but this storm carried something different. Through the window he caught movement between the pines, a figure bent double against the wind, dragging something heavy through knee-deep snow. His hand found the rifle by instinct. Nobody came this far up Copper Ridge without purpose, and purpose usually meant trouble. The figure stumbled, fell, pushed up again. That's when Samuel saw the truth of it, a woman, her coat torn at the shoulder, clutching a bundle to her chest like it held the last warmth in Colorado. She made the porch steps on pure will. Her face emerged from the storm gaunt and wind-burnt eyes the color of wet slate. The bundle against her chest moved. A tiny fist broke free from the blankets, pink and perfect against the white fury of winter. "You Samuel Hartley." Her voice came out raw, each word fighting through chattering teeth. "They said you paid for help." The swell of her belly pushed against her coat, round and unmistakable beneath the worn fabric. Samuel's jaw locked tight. The agency letter sat folded in his pocket. He'd memorized every line. One woman experienced in domestic duties, no complications. This was 3 complications wrapped in wet wool and desperation. Letter didn't mention a child. His voice came out flat as hammered tin. Or another on the way. She shifted the baby higher against her chest. The movement pulled her coat open enough to show the wedding dress, beneath ivory satin gone gray, with road dust, the hem black with mud. Letter didn't mention a lot of things. But I'm here now, and that storm's not letting either of us leave before spring. Wind screamed through the valley below. The baby whimpered a sound thin as paper. Samuel stood there, door half open, cold air rushing past him into the warmth he'd spent 3 years building. The woman didn't beg, didn't plead, just stood there with her chin up, waiting for him to choose. He stepped back, not welcoming, just moving aside. She crossed the threshold slowly, water dripping from her boots onto his clean floors. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and coffee grounds, leather oil, and loneliness. One room with a curtain dividing sleep from living, a stone fireplace that drew true shelves lined with preserves and books whose spines had never been cracked. Everything in its place, untouched by anyone but him since Martha died. The woman set her bundle on the table, not the baby, but a carpet bag held together with twine. She kept the child tight against her, even as her arms shook from cold or exhaustion, or both. "Got a name?" Samuel asked, adding another log to the fire. "Margaret," she paused, considering. "Maggie." "The child?" "Thomas, 10 weeks old." Her hand smoothed the baby's head through the blanket. "His father's dead." Samuel didn't ask how. Death was common as dirt out here. Fever, accident, violence. The why didn't change the what. He pulled a pot from the shelf, ladled leftover stew into it, set it on the stove to warm. Maggie lowered herself into the chair by the fire, moving like her bones might shatter. The wedding dress pooled around her, too fine for this place, too clean to have traveled far. Samuel noticed the lace at the cuffs, handmade. The kind of detail that took months of evening work by candlelight. "You running from something?" He kept his back to her, stirring the pot. "Running to something." She unwrapped Thomas enough to check his fingers, his toes. They're all pink. "Work, shelter, a chance to raise my children somewhere they won't starve." Children, plural. Samuel's hand stilled on the spoon. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the storm built higher, sealing them in with walls of wind and snow. No way down the mountain now, not for weeks, maybe months. He filled a bowl, set it in front of her, with a spoon and a chunk of yesterday's bread. She looked at it like she'd forgotten what food was, then began eating with careful, measured bites. The baby fussed. She shifted him to nurse while she ate, no modesty in it, just necessity. Samuel turned away, busied himself with checking the shutters. The storm would test every board, every nail he'd driven, but the cabin would hold. He'd built it to last, to withstand everything the mountain could throw at it. He just hadn't built it for this, for the sound of a baby's breathing, for the rustle of satin against rough pine floors, for the weight of another person's sorrow filling up the empty spaces. "Back room's yours," he said finally. "Bed's narrow but clean. There's a trunk for your things." Maggie looked up from her bowl. "What about you?" "I'll take the floor by the fire. Done it before." She studied him, then really looked. Saw the premature gray in his beard, the deep lines around his eyes, the careful way he moved like a man holding himself together, with habit and routine. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." He cut her off. You're here to work, not to warm my bed. That's not what I paid for." Something flickered across her face. Relief maybe, or disappointment. Hard to tell in the firelight. She finished her stew in silence. Later, after she'd settled Thomas in a drawer lined with clean flannel, after Samuel had laid out his bedroll by the hearth, she stood in the doorway between the two spaces, still wearing that ruined wedding dress, looking like a ghost who'd lost her way to the altar. "Why did you let us in?" she asked. "You could have turned us away. Most would have." Samuel stared into the dying fire. "Man up here alone gets to thinking he owns the mountain. The silence, the cold." He shifted, pulling the blanket higher. "Then God sends a woman with a baby and another coming, just to remind him he doesn't own anything, not even his own stubbornness." She nodded like that made sense. Maybe it did. Maybe when you were desperate enough, any kindness looked like logic. The wind found every weakness in the walls that night, testing, probing, trying to get in. But the cabin held. And inside, three souls began the slow work of surviving winter together, none of them knowing yet that survival was the easy part. The hard part would be learning how to live. February came in meaner than January left. Samuel woke to Thomas crying, not the thin wail of hunger, but something deeper, more urgent. He rolled from his blanket, bare feet hitting cold boards. Through the curtain he heard Maggie moving, heard her whispered prayers mixing with the baby's fever-pitched screams. "He's burning up." Her voice cracked when Samuel pushed through the divide. She held Thomas against her chest, his small body rigid with pain. "Started an hour ago. Won't take the breast. Won't settle." Samuel touched the baby's forehead. Hot as a stove lid. The kind of fever that took children quick in the mountains before you could ride for help, before you could do anything but watch. "Get snow," he said, already moving to the shelf where he kept the medicine box. "Pack it in cloth. We need to cool him down." Maggie stumbled to the door, nightgown billowing. The wedding dress hung on a peg, now replaced by one of Samuel's old shirts that hung to her knees. She scooped snow with bare hands, not bothering with gloves, the cold nothing compared to the heat radiating from her son. Samuel found the willow bark, started grinding it fine. His hands moved steady, automatic. He'd done this before, 3 years ago. Martha burning with fever, their unborn child, never drawing breath. The bark hadn't been enough then. "How much?" Maggie pressed snow-wrapped cloth to Thomas's neck, his wrists. "Pinch in warm water, not hot, every hour if he'll take it." They worked in silence, moving around each other like they'd done this dance before. Maggie bathing the baby's skin, while Samuel kept the fire steady, not too hot, not too cold. The boy's cries weakened as the hours passed, becoming whimpers, then silence that was worse than screaming. "My first husband died of fever." Maggie spoke to the darkness, rocking Thomas in the chair Samuel had built for Martha. 3 days after our wedding, never got to consummate it. His mother blamed me, said I brought curse to their house. Samuel added another log to the fire. "That why you married again so quick?" "Married his brother 2 months later. Family honor," they said. "Keeping the dowry in the bloodline." Her laugh came out bitter. "He got me with child, then got himself shot in a card game. The family threw me out the day after the funeral. Said the baby wasn't legitimate since the marriage was forced." The baby stirred, took a few drops of the willow bark tea from Samuel's finger. Color still high, but not climbing. "So you answered an advertisement for domestic help?" Samuel wasn't asking. "Advertisement didn't mention how far up the mountain you lived, or that the agency would pocket half my wages as placement fee." She adjusted Thomas against her shoulder. "But it mentioned room and board. That's all that mattered." By dawn, the fever broke. Thomas latched onto his mother's breast like nothing had happened, pulling life back into himself with desperate gulps. Maggie wept then, silent tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. Samuel made coffee, thick and black, set a cup beside her without comment. She looked at him over the baby's head, and something passed between them, not gratitude exactly, but recognition. They'd both held vigil over failing life. They both knew the weight of watching breath continue when it might have stopped. That afternoon, while Thomas slept and snow fell soft as flour, Maggie found the books on the shelf. She pulled one down, ran her fingers over the spine. "You read?" Samuel asked from where he was patching a gap in the wall. "My first husband taught me. Said a woman should know her letters even if she never used them." She opened the book carefully. "Haven't seen a book in 6 months. Take what you want. They're just gathering dust." She chose carefully a volume of poetry, a farmer's almanac, a medical guide with detailed drawings of herbs, stacked them on the small table by her bed like treasures. That evening she cooked properly for the first time since arriving. Not just reheating Samuel's stew, but building something from scratch. Cornbread that rose, golden beans seasoned with the last of the salt pork, dried apples, stewed with cinnamon he didn't know he had. Where, where'd you learn to cook like this? He couldn't help asking after the third piece of cornbread. My mother, before she died, she worked in a hotel kitchen in Denver. Taught me that feeding people was about more than filling their stomachs. She rubbed her belly absently. It's about reminding them they're worth the effort. Samuel felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that he'd nailed shut 3 years ago. Later, as they sat by the fire, him whittling a new spoon, her reading by candlelight, she said, I can feel this one moving now. Little flutters like a bird trying to get out. He looked up from his work. You got a name picked? Grace if it's a girl, my mother's name. And if it's a boy, she met his eyes. Samuel's a good name, strong, dependable. The knife slipped, nicking his thumb. He stuck it in his mouth, tasting copper in surprise. That's presumptuous, he said around his thumb. Is it? She went back to her book, but he caught the smile pulling at her mouth. Man saves my son's life, gives us shelter, asks nothing improper in return. Seems like the kind of man worth naming a child after. The compliment sat heavy between them. Samuel had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as good to be worth something, beyond the wood he could chop or the meat he could hunt. That night, the baby's breathing filled the cabin with life. Maggie's voice drifted through the curtain as she read aloud to Thomas, even though he was too young to understand. Poetry about flowers he'd never seen, places they'd never go. Samuel lay on his bedroll listening. Martha had never read aloud, never filled the silence with unnecessary words. He'd loved her for that, then for understanding that quiet was its own language. But now, hearing Maggie's voice weaving through the darkness, he wondered if he'd been wrong. Maybe silence wasn't peace. Maybe it was just empty space waiting to be filled. The storm outside had gentled to steady snowfall. Inside, the cabin felt different, fuller, like it had been holding its breath for 3 years and finally remembered how to exhale. The stranger arrived with the March thaw. Samuel spotted him first, a rider picking his way up the trail, moving too careful for someone who knew the mountain. City clothes under a borrowed duster, boots that had never seen real mud until recently. The kind of man who brought paper instead of bullets. Get inside, he told Maggie, who was hanging wash on the line. Take Thomas. She looked where he was looking, and her face went white as fresh linen. The wet shirt fell from her hands into the mud. Oh God, they found me. Who found you? But she was already running, scooping Thomas from his basket, disappearing into the cabin. Samuel heard the bar drop across the door from inside. The rider stopped just outside comfortable shooting distance. Smart. He touched his hat brim, a gesture that belonged in a parlor, not a mountain clearing. Mr. Hartley, Samuel Hartley. Who's asking? Name's Pemberton, attorney representing the Whitman estate. He pulled a leather folder from his saddlebag. I'm looking for Margaret Whitman, recently widowed. Traveled this way with an infant. Samuel's rifle rested against the porch rail, easy reach, but not threatening. Yet. Don't know any Margaret Whitman. Pemberton smiled like he'd expected that. The woman currently in your cabin, peering through that crack in the shutters, that would be Mrs. Whitman. Or rather, that would be the woman claiming to be Mrs. Whitman. The crack in the shutters disappeared. State your business or move on, Samuel said. My business is the child. Thomas Whitman, sole heir to a considerable fortune, provided his legitimacy can be verified. Pemberton dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. The family has questions about the marriage, about whether the child was conceived in wedlock or the child's legitimate. Maggie's voice came from behind Samuel. She stood in the doorway, Thomas on her hip, chin raised like she was facing a firing squad. I have the marriage certificate, a certificate that could be forged. The family requires proof. What proof? Samuel asked. The father's dead. The mother's here. The child exists. What more do they want? Pemberton's smile turned sharp. They want the child raised properly, in civilization, with advantages his mother clearly cannot provide. His eyes swept over Maggie's patched dress, her work-roughened hands. They're prepared to offer a generous sum for her to relinquish custody. No, the word came out of Maggie like a bullet. Consider carefully, Mrs. Whitman, or whoever you are. The family has resources, lawyers, influence. They can make things difficult. Samuel stepped between them. That sounds like a threat. It's a legal reality. The child deserves better than... He gestured at the cabin, at the isolation, at everything Samuel had built with his own hands. This, Something cold and familiar woke in Samuel's chest. The same feeling from the war when men in clean uniforms made decisions about ground they'd never walk, battles they'd never fight. "The child deserves his mother," Samuel said quietly, "and you're trespassing." Pemberton's composure cracked slightly. "Mr. Hartley, you should know that harboring a woman of questionable virtue." The rifle was in Samuel's hands before the sentence finished. "Not pointed, just held. Choose your next words careful like." The lawyer backed toward his horse. "This isn't over. The family will petition the court. They'll send marshals if necessary. Let them come." Samuel's voice carried the weight of a man who'd survived worse than lawyers. "Trail gets treacherous this time of year. Lots of accidents. Horses spook. Men get lost." Pemberton mounted quickly but turned for one last word. "She's not worth protecting, Mr. Hartley. Whatever she's told you, whatever you think you know, I know enough." After the rider disappeared down the trail, Samuel found Maggie in the kitchen, gripping the table edge so hard her knuckles went white. Thomas fussed in his basket, picking up his mother's fear. "They want my baby." Her voice came out hollow. "They want to buy him like he's cattle." "Tell me the truth," Samuel said. "All of it." She sank into the chair, suddenly looking older than her years. "My husband, my second husband, was Richard Whitman, youngest son of a banking family. The black sheep. Drank too much, gambled more. They cut him off years ago. But the child stands to inherit if they can't prove he's illegitimate. Richard's father died last winter. Left everything to his grandchildren, skipping Richard entirely. But there's a clause: any child born out of wedlock forfeits their claim." She touched her belly. "This one too, if they know about it. So they'll try to prove you weren't really married, or that Thomas isn't Richard's." She laughed bitterly. "Ironic, since Richard was shooting blanks. 3 years of marriage to his brother, nothing. 2 months with Richard, nothing. Thomas is his brother's child, conceived while I was a widow. But the dates," she shrugged. "The dates could go either way." Samuel absorbed this, turned it over in his mind like a piece of wood he was considering for carving. "So you ran. I took what was mine, my son, and left before they could steal him." She looked up at Samuel. "I know what you're thinking. That I'm a liar, a schemer." "I'm thinking," Samuel said slowly, "that you're a mother protecting her child. Nothing false about that." Something broke in her face then. Not tears, but a kind of crumbling, like she'd been holding herself rigid for so long she'd forgotten how to bend. Samuel caught her as she swayed, his arms going around her automatically. She pressed her face into his shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. "They'll come back," she whispered. "With papers, with men, with guns. Let them." His hand found the back of her head, holding her steady. "This mountain swallowed bigger threats than lawyers." She pulled back enough to look at him. Her face was inches from his, close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, the small scar on her chin. Why would you stand between me and them?" The answer came without thought. "Because you stood between Thomas and death. Because you read poetry to a baby who can't understand words. Because you made cornbread that tasted like home when I'd forgotten I ever had one." She kissed him then. Not passionate, not desperate, but certain. Like a contract sealed, a promise made. When she pulled away, her eyes were clear. "I'm not Margaret Whitman," she said. "Not really, I'm just Maggie. A woman who buried 2 husbands and refuses to bury her child." "I'm not Samuel Hartley," he replied. "Not anymore. Haven't been since Martha died. I'm just Sam. A man who forgot how to live until you reminded me." Outside, water dripped from the eaves as snow melted. Inside, Thomas began to cry, not from fever or fear, but simple hunger. Maggie went to him, lifted him to her breast. Samuel started preparations for dinner, moving around her in the small space, like they'd been doing this dance for years instead of weeks. Neither of them mentioned the kiss. Neither of them mentioned Pemberton's threat. But that night, Samuel didn't lay out his bedroll by the fire. "The floor is cold," Maggie said simply, pulling back the covers on the narrow bed. "Room enough for 2 if we're careful." They lay side by side, not touching, except where they had to. Thomas slept between them in a small basket, his breathing steady and sure. Through the window, stars appeared as clouds cleared, each one sharp as a promise. "They'll come back," Maggie whispered in the darkness. "I know. I might have to run again. Then we'll run together." She found his hand under the covers, laced her fingers through his. "We, you, me, Thomas, the new one when it comes." He squeezed gently. "Family runs together or stands together. No other way. April brought them all Pemberton, two federal marshals, and a woman in black silk who could only be Richard's mother. They came up the trail like a funeral procession, certain of their purpose. Samuel watched them from the ridge, then slipped back through the woods. He found Maggie teaching Thomas to stack wooden blocks. Samuel had carved her belly now, round and prominent under her apron. "They're here," he said. "4 of them, maybe 20 minutes out." Her hands still but didn't shake. These past weeks had changed her, turned her fear into something harder. The papers, hidden where we discussed. The marriage certificate, the real one, was tucked inside a hollow log a mile up the mountain, along with Thomas's birth record and the letter Richard had written before he died, acknowledging the child. Insurance, Samuel had called it. Evidence they couldn't confiscate. And if they tried to take him by force, Samuel pulled back a loose board in the wall, revealing a second rifle. Then they learned what force means up here. But when the party arrived, they came with different weapons. The woman in black, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, stepped down from her horse with the kind of grace that money taught. Her eyes went straight to Thomas, who was toddling now, gripping Maggie's skirt for balance. "He has Richard's eyes," she said softly. Then louder, "May I come in?" Samuel and Maggie exchanged glances. This wasn't what they'd expected. Inside, Eleanor Whitman sat rigidly in the chair by the fire while the marshals waited outside. Pemberton stood behind her like a trained dog. She studied the cabin, the clean floors, the books, the curtains Maggie had sewn from feed sacks. "You've made a home here," Eleanor said. "Not a compliment, just an observation." "We've made do," Maggie replied, keeping Thomas close. "I didn't come to take him." Eleanor's words fell like stones in still water. "I came to see if you were the woman my son described in his letters." She pulled a bundle from her bag, pages covered in Richard's loose scrawl. "He wrote about you, about how you cared for his brother in his final days, how you accepted a marriage you didn't want to preserve family honor, how you never complained even when she paused, when he was unkind." Maggie's breath caught. "Richard wrote about me, constantly. He was planning to leave, to take you somewhere his family couldn't reach. California, perhaps. He'd saved money, made arrangements." Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. "He died the night before you were to leave. Shot by a man he'd cheated at cards, though I suspect the cheating was intentional. Richard always did prefer dramatic exits." She stood, moved closer to Thomas. The boy looked up at her with Richard's eyes, Elizabeth's nose. A perfect blend of both brothers. "He's beautiful," Eleanor whispered. Then to Maggie, "The inheritance is his. I'll see to it personally. Pemberton will draw up papers acknowledging the marriage, the legitimacy, everything." Pemberton started to protest, but Eleanor silenced him with a look that could freeze flame. But Eleanor continued, "I have conditions." Here it comes, Samuel thought. The trap. "I want to know him. Letters, photographs when you can manage them. Perhaps," she hesitated, showing vulnerability for the first time, "perhaps a visit once a year. Here or wherever you are." "Why?" Maggie asked. "Why not fight for custody? You have the money, the lawyers." Eleanor touched Thomas's cheek gently. He grabbed her finger, smiled. "Because my sons are dead, both of them. I killed them with expectations, with demands, with the weight of the Whitman name." She looked at Maggie directly. "You ran to save him from that weight. How could I do less?" She turned to leave, then paused. "The man, Mr. Hartley, your husband." "Not yet," Maggie said, then blushed. Eleanor studied Samuel with eyes that had measured many men. "He'll do," she said simply. "Richard would have liked him. No pretense." At the door, she stopped once more. "The second child, when it comes, it will have the same rights as Thomas. I'll see to that too." After they left, the cabin felt too quiet. Thomas played with his blocks, unaware of how his life had just changed. Maggie stood at the window, watching the procession disappear down the trail. "She could have destroyed us," Maggie said softly. "But she didn't. She chose mercy." "No." Samuel wrapped his arms around her from behind, careful of her belly. "She chose love. Different thing entirely." That night they didn't pretend about separate beds. Samuel held Maggie as she cried for Richard, for his brother, for Eleanor, for all the pain that had led them to this mountain. When the tears stopped, she turned in his arms. "Marry me," she said, "not for protection or propriety. Marry me because I love you, because Thomas loves you, because this child I'm carrying should have your name even if it's not your blood." Samuel kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth. "Yes," he said between kisses. Yes to all of it. Grace came during a May thunderstorm, fast and fierce, like she'd been waiting too long already. Samuel had ridden for the midwife at the first sign, but the bridge washed out at Miller's Creek. He turned back soaked and swearing to find Maggie gripping the bedpost, Thomas crying in his basket, and the baby coming whether they were ready or not. I can't, Maggie gasped. It's too fast. Something's wrong. Nothing was wrong except fear. Samuel had read the medical books, memorized the pages. He knew what to look for, what to do. Knowing and doing were different beasts, but there was no choice now. Look at me, he said, steady as he could manage. I'm here, we're doing this together. Thunder shook the cabin. Lightning turned the windows white. Between the flashes, Samuel worked by lamplight, talking Maggie through each pain, each push. His hands shook, but his voice didn't. I can see her head, dark hair like her mama. One more push, Maggie, just one more. Grace entered the world screaming, furious at the storm, at the disruption, at everything. Samuel caught her in hands that had built this cabin, that had held a rifle, that had learned gentleness, late but completely. He cleared her mouth, her nose, counted fingers and toes while rain hammered the roof. Is she? Maggie couldn't finish. She's perfect. He placed the baby on Maggie's chest, watched them find each other. Loud as her brother, twice as stubborn as her mother. Maggie laughed through tears. What does that make her, father? The word stopped him cold. Father. Not by blood, but by choice, by presence, by the simple act of staying. Grateful, he said finally, makes him grateful. The storm passed with dawn, leaving the world washed and gleaming. Samuel stepped onto the porch with Thomas on his hip, the boy pointing at puddles, babbling his opinions. Inside, Maggie nursed Grace while reading from the poetry book, her voice soft but sure. 3 weeks later, Pastor Williams made the journey up from Copper Creek. He married them in the meadow behind the cabin, wildflowers blooming purple and gold around them. Thomas toddled between them during the vows, chasing a butterfly. Grace slept through the whole thing, content in her mother's arms. Do you, Samuel Hartley, take this woman and her children as your family to protect and provide, to cherish and keep for all your days? I do. The words came out rough. I did already. This just makes it official. Maggie wore the wedding dress, cleaned, mended, transformed. Not perfect, but honest. When Samuel kissed her, Thomas laughed and clapped, and even Grace opened one eye as if to check what the fuss was about. Eleanor arrived in September as promised. She came alone, leaving Pemberton and Pretense at the bottom of the mountain. She brought gifts books for Thomas, a silver rattle for Grace, a sewing machine for Maggie that must have cost a fortune to haul up the trail. For Samuel, she said, producing a leather journal. Richard wrote in one just like this, said it helped him make sense of things. She stayed 3 days, taught Thomas to count on his fingers, held Grace while she napped, helped Maggie harvest the garden they'd planted together. On the last evening, she sat with Samuel on the porch while the others slept. You saved them, she said simply. They saved me first. Eleanor smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Richard would be glad. To know they're loved, to know they're free. What about you? Are you free? She considered this. I'm learning. It's harder when you're old, when the cage has been there so long, you mistake it for bones. She stood to leave. But seeing them here, seeing what you've built, it helps. Winter came gentle that year, like the mountain had decided they'd earned a reprieve. Snow fell soft and steady, covering the cabin in quiet blankets. Inside, life bloomed warm and chaotic. Thomas learned his letters, tracing them in flour on the table. Grace found her feet stumbling from furniture to furniture with delighted shrieks. Maggie's garden cellar bulged with preserves, proof against the cold. Samuel wrote in the journal Eleanor had given him. Not every day, but when the words came. Today, Thomas called me Papa. Not planned or prompted. He fell skinned, his knee came running. Papa, fix it, he said, like I'd always been that to him. Maybe I have been. Maybe that's what love is, not the blood you share, but the wounds you tend. Maggie, pregnant again, says she can tell by how coffee smells wrong. She's scared not of the birth, but of happiness. Says it feels too big, too much, like it might burst if we're not careful. I told her we're not careful people. Careful people don't survive what we survived. Don't build what we built. We're brave people, and brave people let happiness come even when it terrifies them. Grace said her first word today. No. Said it to everything. No to breakfast. No to nap time. No to Thomas taking her toy. Maggie laughed till she cried. Said it was perfect, a girl who knows her own mind from the start. I think about the world she'll grow up in, different from the one that tried to crush her mother. We're building that world here one no at a time. The letter came in spring. Eleanor had died quietly in her sleep. She'd left the Whitman fortune in trust for the children, but with a twist that made Pemberton furious. They couldn't access it until they were 25, and only if they'd learned to trade any trade that could support them without the money. She wanted them to know work, Maggie said, reading the will. To know they could survive without the fortune. They already know that, Samuel said, watching Thomas help Grace stack blocks, patient, when she knocked them down, starting over each time. The second boy came in Summer Samuel Jr., though they called him Sam. Born easy as breathing, like he'd been waiting for the right moment. Eleanor's machine stitched his blankets. Thomas sang him lullabies. Grace brought him toys he couldn't hold, yet frustrated by his limitations. The cabin expanded another room, then another. Not fancy, but solid. Samuel taught Thomas to hold a hammer, to measure twice, cut once. Maggie taught Grace to read, though the girl preferred making up her own stories. Years folded into each other like pages in a book. The children grew tall and strong, brown from sun, calloused from work, rich in ways that had nothing to do with the fortune waiting for them below. They knew the name of every bird on the mountain, could track deer through new snow, make bread from memory, and deliver a calf if needed. People in Copper Creek still talked about the hermit and his strange family, the woman who'd appeared in a wedding dress, the children who might be heirs to a fortune. But when they saw them in town buying supplies, trading preserves, the children playing with others, the talk gentled. Hard to fear a family that laughed so easily, that held hands while walking, that looked at each other like they'd discovered gold in ordinary ground. One autumn evening, 15 years after Maggie had stumbled through his door, Samuel found her in the garden. The sun set behind the mountains, painting everything gold. She stood among the rows of corn, one hand on her hip, watching their children, all four of them, now chase fireflies. "We did it," she said softly. "We built something that lasts." He wrapped his arms around her, breathed in the smell of earth and green and home. "No," he corrected. "We became something that lasts." Thomas had his mother's stubborn streak and his father's careful hands. He'd grown tall, thoughtful, already talking about studying medicine. Grace was fire and laughter, challenging everything, afraid of nothing. Little Sam was the quiet one, the watcher who noticed things others missed. And Lucy, their last surprise, born when Maggie thought she was done. Lucy was pure joy, singing from sunrise to sunset. "The money's there soon," Maggie said. "Thomas turns 25 next year. Think he'll take it, dommage?" She smiled. "He'll take enough to build a clinic in Copper Creek. Leave the rest for the others. He told me yesterday, said money's just another tool. You got to know what you're building before you pick it up." Samuel kissed the top of her head. "Smart boy." "Like his father." "All his fathers," Samuel corrected. "The ones who died and the one who stayed." That winter, Samuel carved a new sign for the cabin. Not Hartley or Whitman, but home. Simple, true. He hung it by the door on Christmas morning while snow fell, and his family slept the house full of the breathing of people who'd found each other against all odds. When spring came again, it brought Eleanor's roses, seeds she'd sent before she died, finally blooming. They climbed the porch rails, wild and proper, both refusing to be one thing or another. Perfect for this place. Perfect for this family that had grown from disaster, from necessity, from the simple act of opening a door in a storm. Samuel stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the ridge. Inside, he heard Maggie starting breakfast, Grace arguing with Thomas about something, Sam laughing at them both, Lucy singing off-key but enthusiastic. Some stories, he thought, don't end with dying or leaving or losing. Some stories end with living day after day, season after season, until the living itself becomes the story. Until the mountain and the family and the love are so tangled together, you can't say where one ends and another begins. Maggie called him for breakfast. He turned, walked inside into the warmth and chaos and grace of the life they'd built. The door closed behind him, but the sign remained, speaking its simple truth to anyone who climbed the trail. Home. Not a destination, but a decision made new each morning, each storm, each spring. Home.